And I would also say, though, I think he's very critical of capitalism and doesn't want to concede much to capitalism. I do think he gives you, in spite of himself, some sense of why people were so excited about this thing in the first place. Not
about
just
the book or capitalism.
No, about capitalism. You see it, of course, famously in the Communist Manifesto, some sense of the marvel of this monster.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by contributing editor Alex Gurevich. Hello.
Hello.
And welcome back to Corey Robin. How are you, Corey?
Hi. Good. How are you guys?
Very well. Corey was last on, listeners, if you want to check that one out, on episode 481, came out about a year ago. Everything is Plausible, Oligarchy, or worse, where we discussed Trump's government, his motives, and his modus operandi. I was kind of trying to reflect back on that episode and wonder whether we would come to some slightly different conclusions a year on from that one. A lot happened in 2025. Anyway, but that's not what we're going to be discussing here. What we are going to be discussing is Corey's review in The Nation of a new book by Sven Beckert called Capitalism, A Global History. Now, just to set this up, we don't normally talk to the author of a review of a book. Sometimes that gets a little bit too meta. We prefer to speak to the author directly, but we're making an exception in this case for a couple of reasons. So, firstly, the book is 1,000 pages or so, and we always read in full the books that we talk about on here, and we haven't had time to read those 1,000 pages, but Corey has, and Corey's review is not only excellent, but scathing, and I'm usually inclined to trust Corey's opinion on these matters. So we're going to be talking to Corey about the book. But more than just that, it gives us an opportunity to talk about capitalism, how to understand it, and to discuss how capitalism is being understood in our day and age. And moreover, what those understandings say about our day and age. After all, a book about global capitalism's history would surely read differently written today versus the US of 1992, say, or the 1970s, or China in the 2040s. But let's not speculate about these imaginary examples right now. And let's turn to the book itself. So you wrote this long review of Sven Beckert's Capitalism, A Global History, and you're quite critical, and we'll get to all of those. But to start, could you tell us a little bit about the book itself? Where does it start? What are the main moments in his story?
Yeah. So thank you, first of all, for having me here and giving us the chance to talk about this. There are many theses in this book, not all of them reconcilable or fitting together. I think the main ambition of the book is in the subtitle, Capitalism, A Global History. And it's to argue that capitalism is not something that just became global, but it was something that was born global. There are multiple sites where capitalism begins, and that the effort to find one time and place is a bit of a fool's errand, and we can talk about what's going on there in a second. But history has to begin somewhere when you're writing it. And so where Beckert chooses to begin is in the port of Aden in the 12th century, around 1150 in the Common Era. And he begins with a class of merchants, essentially. These are long-distance merchants. They're a variety of ethnicities and religions, Hindu, Arab, Muslim, Arabic, Jewish. The common language seems to be Arabic that they all use. And Beckert gives, I have to say, to give Beckert his due, he gives a kind of beguiling picture of these long distance merchants and just the sheer volume and number of commodities that they're engaged in terms of trade. I think he says at some point, one merchant moving out of Aden a bit in Cairo is engaged in the trade of 83 different commodities. So these are not merchants who are attached to one single commodity, but a diverse portfolio, we might say, are investing in a wide variety of different opportunities. And why he begins with them is that he ultimately says that these were the first capitalists. And what makes them the first capitalists is that he says that they are engaged in an enterprise of accumulation for accumulation's sake, that they see investment as an opportunity to gain more profit. And the fact that it's long distance, that it says that these are not just little local limited trades, but essentially limitless opportunities for trade. He's very careful to say that these are capitalists without capitalism, which will be important, I think, a little bit later on. But that they pioneer, what he really says is actually that they pioneer a new type of economic life or economic being, that they contain within themselves the germ of a new way of relating to economic life. And that new way is capitalist, based on unlimited accumulation and search for profit.
Yeah, so there's so many questions I want to ask about this, both coming from your thesis and just from the content of this claim. But sort of before getting to your criticisms, I wonder if you could just fill in the blanks here of his story in two ways. One is, what are the steps that he then thinks are necessary to go from capitalists to capitalism? What are the sort of next key moments in the story? And then I want to ask you something about the ambition here overall, but maybe just that question first.
I'm going to answer the question, but I want to preface it by saying, I think when you ask the question, you're asking what are the conceptually, historically necessary conditions, and in order to, with some kind of an understanding of what capitalism is, what has to happen in order for something that we call capitalism to develop. I just want to, the reason I say that is because I think you and your listeners, that's what you're coming at this with. I don't think that's the way Beckert, to the extent that he really thinks about this, and I don't say that in a snarky way because I'm not entirely sure that he really thinks about these questions that much or that consistently. But when he answers that question, he's just going to say descriptively. It's really like what ends up happening, and he takes the historian line of contingency that, what are the contingent set of things that happen that leads to capitalism. So the two things that I think he thinks are very important are, first of all, the state. And I think this is a pretty well-established argument in the historiography that there was the nature of the state structure that develops in Europe is peculiar, because whereas and he uses the comparison with the Chinese Empire. The Chinese Empire was a very powerful state. It had very powerful control over a geographic region that was far vaster, certainly than Western Europe, if not Europe as a whole. And so that they were able to control the process of production and exchange through a highly developed bureaucratic civil servant class. And that this puts, real constraints on the development of a capitalist class in capitalism. In Europe, by contrast, you have a lot of fledgling states competing, intense competition between state actors in France, in Spain, the Dutch Republic, in Britain, and they need funds in order to consolidate their power and defend themselves and engage in the kinds of wars that they're engaged in. And they don't have the taxing power to do it domestically, and so they become very dependent on a group of financiers, mostly on the Italian peninsula, later in the Dutch Republic. But it is the relationship, that parasitic relationship between a capitalist class of lenders and loaners, financiers, and the state is the first thing. and that the state needs capital more than capital needs the state. But what capital gets from the state, and now we get back to those merchants in Aden, is the ability with state protection to start engaging in trade out into the Atlantic, down the coast of the African coast, and ultimately around the African continent. And why that's so important is that this is the way that these European merchants are going to be able to break the hold that those Middle Eastern merchants, the merchants in the Levant, have between, let's say, North Africa and Asia, that all trade is essentially controlled by this Levantine front. And by breaking out into the Atlantic with the protection of, let's say, the French Navy or the Spanish Navy or whatever, these traders get a kind of a monopoly over a new set of trading routes, and that this is going to be very important for the accumulation of capital. So the state is a critical feature. I should say this is, you see this in Max Weber develops this argument. He actually calls it political capitalism, this synergy between financiers and bankers and states. And it's different. You don't see this happening, let's say, in China, where there's, a developed merchant class. That's one part of the argument that you're asking. The second is that these financiers, as they start breaking out into the Atlantic, they start getting control over agricultural production. So hitherto, in the 12th century, the 11th century, the 13th century, these people, the merchant class, are making profit by trade. Buy low, sell high. Very old, familiar kind of profit making, nothing new. However, through a series of steps that we can get into if you want more, as they do this breakout into the Atlantic down the African coast, they start, through the acquisition of enslaved labor, getting control over the production of commodities, most primarily sugar. As they cross over into the New World, into the Americas, those commodities are going to extend from sugar to tobacco and ultimately to cotton, which is going to be the big prize several centuries down the road. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But in any event, it's that control over the labor of agricultural workers that he is going to say is very important. I can say a lot more about both of these things and how it fits with my point about how he's very confusing and confused conceptually about all this. But I'll stop there in the interest of not monologuing.
Just before we get onto some of these conceptual things, I know we want to get onto them. I mean, you do have some praise for the book, I think. I mean, you say that, he zooms in and out nicely on, various different places and times, the city of Surat in Western India, the island of Barbados in 1646, linen industry in southwestern Poland, a strike of Senegalese workers in 1919, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, is there something good to be said at the descriptive level? If you say that, you can say, well, its strength is descriptive, even if it conceptually is lacking.
I came into this book, I am not, as Alex Gurevich will tell you, I'm a sort of latecomer to questions of Marxist theory and Marxist history. And I don't really have a firm stake in various debates. So I come to this book in I think, an extremely open-minded way. And in fact, if anything, I would say when I read history, I'm sort of allergic to a lot of theoretical and conceptual formulations. I actually prefer the thick description and empirical narrative history, and because it allows me to make my own conclusions to some degree. I understand that no narrative is innocent and absent of theory, obviously, but I respect the autonomy of that enterprise. I don't expect historians to be political theorists. I don't ask that of them. So at that level, what I do appreciate, well, let me say what I appreciate in a minute, but I just want to say the problem with Beckert is that I think he wants to have it both ways. He wants to be both a kind of theoretical person, but doesn't want to then commit to what that entails. So we'll come back to that. But at that descriptive level, he does, I would say it's what he really does very well, for at least for a reader like me, is give you a sense of how capitalism, let's say the centers of capitalism, are moving geographically, both in time and space. And I get myself very frustrated with a lot of theoretical conversations around capitalism and within Marxism at the absence of specificity and concreteness. That they're often floating 30,000 feet above sea level. And with Beckert, you really, like you could look on a map, you know where you are, you know what's happening, and you know specifically that this is the 12th century and not the 13th century. And I don't know about you all, but I could remember, 2015 versus 2020 very clearly. But, what's the difference between the 13th century and the 15th century? This all starts to blur. And I do believe that Beckert really does quite a good job of not only showing the reader these things, but leading the reader by the hand and reminding the reader where we are and that we start here and we move there and then we come out here. And also gives, and you mentioned some of those set pieces that he opens every chapter with. And sometimes it's a city, and sometimes it's an industry, and sometimes it's a family, and sometimes it's a commodity. And it just that it's not just different set pieces, but that they're different kinds of things, gives you a real sense of the robustness of capitalism. And I would also say, though, I think he's very critical of capitalism and doesn't want to concede much to capitalism. I do think he gives you, in spite of himself, some sense of why people were so excited about this thing in the first place. Not
about
just
the book or capitalism.
No, about capitalism. You see it, of course, famously in the Communist Manifesto, some sense of the marvel of this the marvel of this monster. We tend to focus on the monster. I think Marx was very alive to both the marvel of the monster, and I think Beckert gives you some sense of the marvel as well. And it's not just the amounts of things, but the sheer variety and that sense of connection across vast spaces. And if I really wanted to be complimentary, it reminds me a bit of the Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish novelist who won the Nobel Prize. Her vast novel, The Books of Jacob, which is about Eastern Europe and sort of Jewish messianism and all kinds of other stuff in the 18th, 17th century. But she too has that sense of these traders and just what it's like, for something from, the Levant, from Syria, to show up in Ukraine or southern Poland. And I think he captures some of that, which I think just the sheer explosion of experience that capitalism was about, I think he does quite well.
So, Corey, on that note, could you tell us something about the ambition of the book? Because when I first saw this book appear, I thought, here's finally the historical profession breaking out of this tendency it's had for decades to write about the local, the particular, the singular life, to eschew grand narratives, to avoid the attempts at sort of large syntheses. Here's an attempt to tell history, human as human history, about the most vital and central aspects and moments in it as it touches everyone. But then as you write the review and as you've described it, none of the bigger claims seem all that new. So the importance of the Atlantic trade routes, or the colonial origins of capitalism, or the global structure of it, or the distinction between capitalists and capitalism. Each of these things seem to be familiar from claims that have been made by many historians beforehand. And so I'm kind of wondering what you think the ambition is and what's supposed to be kind of novel to somebody who doesn't already, or who has been following the literature before, or who wants to know why this one as opposed to many of the other attempts to write a history of capitalism. Do you have a sense of that from how he writes?
I think I do. I don't know if I could say that this is his intention. I think the question of what he aims to do, what he is doing, what he thinks he's doing, what he is doing, these are all very, very different things. But I'll tell you as a reader what I think what the ambition that comes through and succeeds in, which I think gets at part of what you're talking about. You framed it as, in the last part of your question, as, he doesn't really tell us anything about the history of capitalism, and I think that is true. But you began your question in a different place, which was that we've been kind of going through these decades of historiography about the local. The more particular, the more discrete, the more historical it is. And I think this is a particular pathology of the United States, the history of the United States. There's been some effort to break out into the transnational, but I think it hasn't been all that successful. I think what he does do is not the history of capitalism. I think he gives you a real sense of world history, and I think those are very different things. In other words, he gives you a synthetic way of understanding that what's happening in Genoa in 1450 and what's happening on the Mali coast at the same time or a little bit later, and what's happening in Cape Verde. All of these things. I mean, the one hemisphere that's not really covered until a little bit later, apologies, Alex in Sao Paulo, is the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. But he does really give you this sense of integrated world history. And I don't think you learn much about capitalism, but I do think theorists of capitalism he does this, I would say, almost in certain ways better than Hobsbawm does it. A, because it begins earlier, and B, because Hobsbawm's narrative is framed, it's the virtue of Hobsbawm, but he's got such a clear narrative through line, which Beckert doesn't really have. So I would say at that level, I think, again, I don't know if that was his ambition, but that's the part that I think succeeds. And it doesn't have that feeling of, oh, you got to include this, you got to include that, and you can't just focus on this or that. It really does give you a sense of, what I think, in fact, people in the 19th century were kind of stunned by capitalism, it really was the globe. And I think it does succeed at that level. I don't think it tells you that much, though, new about capitalism. And I think for other historians and for a next generation, I think that notion that capitalism could be the thing to give you a sense of world history, I think that provides an ambition for a next generation, because it gives you the world history. It gives you a kind of not real sense of capitalism, but it tells you that we're in a moment where capitalism may once again become the master narrative to help us understand the development of global history. And I think that, to me, would be the real ambition. Now, that has some problems and costs, which maybe we can talk about. But I just wanted to add that last little piece to the argument.
That's super helpful, because it's a useful transition to what seem to be the weaker parts of the book, and where the failures of the book speak to some of the wider themes of contemporary political life, especially those that animate this podcast. So one thing that you say repeatedly is that, I guess at the beginning, he does distinguish between capitalists and capitalism, but then he never really gives us a sustained account of what capitalism is. So he's writing this global history of something, but we don't know what the thing is.
Yeah.
Such that at some point it looks like the choice of when it began was kind of arbitrary. And the way you point this out is you say capital and capitalists are old concepts. They emerge much earlier than capitalism, which hints at a theoretically significant distinguish between people who happen to be engaging in capitalistic activity, the old Weberian distinction, which you find throughout history. Just lending money to earn a profit or investing money to earn a profit, you can find in the Athenian in the ancient Athenian and Roman city-states. You can find them in, the Mesoamerica. You can find them anywhere. What's different is capitalism as a structure of market dependent production and trade. But he doesn't seem to kind of have that distinction working. What do you think is important about this failure in his telling of the history?
Yeah, and just to tack something on, because I think you make a note about his use of the term vanguard and something else which now escapes me. But I mean, basically, I think one could buy and can accept the notion of capitalists without capitalism, capitalists before capitalism, but 800 years of it, then when does, is that not stretching credulity? Is this a vanguard which just arrives very early? I mean, how does that actually work itself through, and where's the, does quantity suddenly change quality at a certain point 800 years down the road?
They played a really long game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you guys are asking sort of different questions, and I'm going to start with Alex in Sao Paulo. I mean, I think here the decision to start in Aden is significant for a second reason, which I did not discuss in the review, but I think it's worth noting that this is a Muslim phenomenon. Arab Muslim. I mean, there's Jews, there's Christians, there's Hindus, but he's centering it there for a reason. And it becomes very clear that while not thought through theoretically, because in the end he's going to say, because he's going to come up with this series of terms for them, and that none of which can hold up to scrutiny. But I think the real significance is to try to decenter, the role of Christian Europe. And it gets him, and I'm perfectly fine with that move if it holds up, but it really gets him into some very peculiar kinds of, honestly, cultural identity politics that I was frankly surprised. And I don't know that anybody's really brought this up, and I'm not sure why, because it was sort of wince-inducing to read, to be honest with you, because he makes a big deal of, it gives you this very, as I said, beguiling view of these trading networks and, the indigo, the sandalwood. And you've got this image of a Middle Eastern bazaar with all the spices and all the kinds of things that people get all woo-woo about when it comes to trade and marketplaces and such. And, there's a very brief, not very brief, doesn't even say it, amongst the massive lists of commodities being traded, he'll say slaves, buried in there. So, it's all that. And he makes no mention at all of the Muslim conquest, of the kind of creation of, empire through violence. And when he then talks about Christian Europe, he makes a very big deal of the Crusades and the violence of the Crusades as kind of creating an opening for the sort of trade networks to expand. When he talks about trade, in fact, in North Africa, sort of from, I can't remember all the specific places, he makes a big point of saying that you could, go across and you didn't need any security at all. So there's this picture painted of this very ironic, peaceful, almost pastoral vision of trade that then takes on, bad capitalism. And actually, maybe this is beginning to get the answer to Alex G to your question, that is going to arise in Europe. And is, and you can see the kind of silly academic identity politics playing out there. And if this were just one page, it'd be like, whatever, who cares? It's the first 100 pages of the book. And I found it, stunning. And if I had, it took too much space already in the piece, I would have talked more about it. But I think that's part of the answer to your question, Alex H, about, why so many years. I think there is some kind of perverse, effort to find, alternative trading, capitalist. giving them the historical agency to have been significantly created something, but innocent, morally and politically innocent. And I say this very hesitantly. I'm not trying to like stir up anything. It was so crude and so it's just not a good way to start a book. It doesn't give you much confidence in your author, that they're playing a game, and that they don't have their commitments are unreliable, I guess is what, that it's not really about.
Yeah. That's all interesting when we come to, in a bit, trying to historicize Beckert or trying to place this history of capitalism within the history of capitalism, if that's not too corny.
Yeah. But I think then, Alex G, to answer your question, so what's different? Like he mentions market dependency early. I mean, I should say he has a 30-page prologue introduction, about definite, allegedly conceptualizing, but it's sort of too long and too short, if you can believe it, because it sort of says everything and nothing at the same time. It mentions market dependency, having to get all of one's everything through the market, but then he completely contradicts himself, throughout much of the text, where oftentimes people are not getting things through the market at all. And so it's a very loosey-goosey. So I don't think market dependency plays much of a role. I think it really, if I were to say what he would say it is really this alliance between states, very violent forms of state action, and the accumulation of wealth. I think that's really, and that it expands. I think it's a fairly crude understanding. I mean, you could see how it's parasitic and poaching from some much more robust theoretical traditions, but I think it really comes down to that, which will explain some of the confusion you get to later between war capitalism and industrial capitalism and all the rest. But yeah, violent states, accumulation of wealth and expanding.
It's interesting because the two things you say about like this sort of slightly idyllic beginning, one is it weirdly, when I think of other history of capitalism that try to find its origins in the kind of virtuous trading activities, I think of people like Deirdre McCloskey or, the bourgeois virtues kind of argument, and just saying, well, but it wasn't Western merchants. It was sort of Middle Eastern, mostly Muslim traders within a Muslim empire whose imperial bits have sort of faded into the mist of time. But I wonder if you think that the reason that you end up with this sort of arbitrary, somewhat moralistic beginning is because he doesn't have a particularly clear concept of what capitalism as a global structure is, such that we'd know such that we'd have some scientific basis for identifying it. Because once we're just looking for this vanguard of people engaged in profit-making activity, why not find them in the people linking the different Greek city-states or engaged in commerce from Athens to the west coast of what we call India, or find it in the people linking the various Mesoamerican civilizations together in the New World? It seems like if you don't have a conception of what capitalism is, then you don't have a scientific basis for distinguishing when the globe wasn't capitalist such that it became capitalist. And then all you've got is some set of moral preferences or just like an arbitrary, a kind of, well, here's a moment.
Yeah, I would say that it is both arbitrary and moralistic. I think those are the two sensibilities at play here. I mean, you're absolutely right. I really puzzled over this notion of the global. He's very emphatic about this. It's born global. What does that mean? Because he also is very frank that it's not the Americas. So, is it simply that, there's this sort of spot where Europe, Africa, and Asia come together? And why is that global? And is it the physical distance? I thought, or maybe it was physical distance. And then I start looking at the map and I'm like, no, as you rightly point out, Alex G, In the ancient world, those distances were pretty vast, almost comparable. So that can't be it. I do think he thinks there's some notion of cultural connected diversity, which is what he uses. But that's also problematic as well, because of course, for two reasons. One, he's very specific that the merchant class in Cairo is very similar to the merchant class in Canton. They may speak different languages, but he says they would recognize each other. They're able to, it's in fact the similarities between them that allows them to engage in these kinds of acts of trade. They know each other. They have family connections. There are all kinds of things. So that can't be it. And then on the flip side, if you take, the Brenner argument, or, a lot of other people's arguments as well, the cultural distance separating the lord in the English countryside from the peasant is far greater. The social distance is huge, far greater than the distance separating these merchants, cultural distance, I should say, separating these merchants. So he has no account of this. And he doesn't even, I shouldn't say he doesn't try to provide one. He does, but it contradicts itself. It makes no sense. It's not thought through. And so then I think you are left to fall back on this sort of set of moralistic, desire to claim, the cradle of civilization or capitalism, is with brown people. And I don't have a problem with politically driven history, but it's got to be, but then you have to sustain those commitments, and those commitments have to discipline the scholarship. But he doesn't do that. And he doesn't carry it through, because at the end of his story about Aden, he says, well, in the end, they were harbingers, they were thises, they were that's, they were nothing at all. They didn't really play a role. And he's quite frank about this. And so then, as you say, well, then why not have begun with the Athenians? Why not have begun, elsewhere? And there's no answer to that question. And again, I don't want to turn this into some, thing about, academic politics and all the rest of it, but it's shabby. The result is a really intellectually shabby account.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to wince at concepts like, or as you put them, catchphrases which parade as concepts like connected diversity, which really does date the book. I mean, and it dates it to perhaps not even 2026, but 2015, perhaps, or if you want to take that as the apex of that sort of ideology. But
even before that, I'm sorry, even before that, when I was in college, there was the thing that people used to sing, unity with diversity, diversity. Yeah. Sorry.
So, Corey, I mean, what I found interesting about your review was, had this been the only issue with the book, or had specifically politically, had the politics of the book just been about this weird kind of woke veneer to it, then I don't think it would have been that interesting. But you say that at a deeper level, the problem with this way of writing history is you end up not with history, but with some just so stories. So Aden becomes this first sort of, in the beginning there was, or I think you say, once upon a time. And you draw from this the thought that this is what history writing looks like, and particularly the history of capitalism looks like at the end of history.
Yeah.
Namely, when we can't really imagine anything outside it, it's just this sort of all-encompassing sort of social order. There's sort of resistance to defining exactly what it is, because that would sort of implicitly also engage you in defining alternatives to it. But we can't really imagine any of those. And so everything just looks like a bit like a lead up to the main act. And so I wanted you to say a little bit more about that, because it did suggest that, at least when it comes to writing the history of capitalism, we're still at the end of history. We're not a lot has happened since Fukuyama. If Fukuyama had written a history of capitalism rather than, say, liberalism, this is the history we would have gotten, perhaps. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that as the kind of wider political critique you had of it, and maybe how it relates also to your observation that capitalism is a term originally invented by its enemies.
Yeah. So let me preface this by saying that Beckert, at the very beginning, at the very end, affirms that capitalism is, like all historical phenomena, a creature of time and place, and that it began and it will end. He says that. And I think, and he clearly opposes capitalism or parts of it. He's not a cheerleader. He's not Deirdre McCloskey. And I want to get that out there because I think it can be very difficult and a little bit vertiginous for readers of this review who've read the book to say, wait a minute, how can you say that the book is claiming that capitalism would never end? But this is where somebody's overt statements and political and moral sympathies are contradicted by the deep structure of their thinking, to the extent that there's been a lot of thinking that's gone into this. And because the story, as I say, you never trust the teller, trust the tale. That was D.H. Lawrence's famous dictum. And I think in this case, it's very true, because the tale he tells is of essentially a kind of a feature of human nature. If you start with those Aden merchants, and he says they invent, why are they the first capitalists? Because they invent a new form of economic life. But if they didn't invent a new form of economic being or life, which they didn't, you're now stretching back into most of known human history, way back into antiquity, right? Because we see those features then all over the place. And then when he gets to the end and you realize that there's been, that the one effort to sort of take this on is really a kind of 30-year parenthesis in the whole scheme of human history, you are left with the sense that this is not just history. This is human nature, human life. Now, he would never say that. I wouldn't accuse him of actually believing that, but that's the story he is essentially telling. And I think we really have to distinguish between the story he tells versus the story he claims to be telling or wants to tell. And I think it is, as you say, Alex, it is a history of capitalism at the end of history. And I end with a comparison. People make a lot of the Dobb-Sweezy debate. I look at a different, lesser-known debate between Maurice Dobb, the economic historian, economist at Cambridge, Marxist, and R.H. Tawney, the sort of Christian socialist historian. And they had a debate about Dobb's theories of capitalism, which were very analytically precise. And they argued, whether it was too precise, too narrow, or it couldn't be opened up a little bit. But what was interesting about that debate, which was conducted at a very high level of theory and history, empirical, narrative, theoretically informed, these guys, that's what they were, is that it was framed by the sense that there was an alternative to capitalism, whether it was, Eastern European communism, or democratic socialism, or guild socialism, or, the vast array of working class movements. This debate took place in 1950. And it's interesting that, people who were on opposite sides of that debate and debating all the very questions that many people debate today about definitions of capitalism and so forth, felt bound to define it in such a way that it really did delimit a perimeter in time and space. It had to. And Beckert doesn't define capitalism in any way that delimits time and space. In fact, he says at the beginning, I focus on the whole globe because it is the space where capitalism emerged and developed. I focus on the whole globe. In the original, I read this in proofs. It said, I focus on the planet Earth. I focus on planet Earth. And which I think is a very, they got rid of it, so we're not going to, make too much of this. But it's a telling sense that this is all of space, essentially. Human space is capitalist. And then when he talks about the transition to capitalism, he says it happens not one moment, but every day, ongoingly. And, I feel like the game is up. Like you could say you hate capitalism all you want, but if ought implies can, and time and space are completely collapsed. I don't know what you're left with there, except what you just said, Alex, which is it's a history of capitalism at the end of history.
So, I mean, there's so many strands and threads that I'd like to pick at there. I mean, it's quite clear that it's increasingly difficult to see beyond capitalism in contemporaneously in space, and also to project a world beyond capitalism in the future, because there are no social movements which seem to push beyond it. And therefore, we see capitalism everywhere, the point which Alex has already made. And then we project that back into the past, that kind of everything kind of looks like capitalism because we don't even know what to look for to see something that isn't. Or perhaps even, and I wonder whether this comes through in Beckert, whether his emphasis on a sort of trans-historical forced labor, coercion, violence is itself a way of kind of smoothing over the boundaries between capitalism and non-capitalism. That somehow he ends up naming, I mean, to put it really crudely, but ends up naming violence capitalism and goes, well, look, human history is most of the time pretty dirty and violent, and then that's all that there is. The other thing, if we see the end of, to speak directly to the point that Alex has already raised, the kind of more concrete and particular sense of the end of history, in the concrete sense related directly to U.S. hegemony, the conception of the long 1990s, etc., the Fukuyaman moment, then I would imagine that Beckert, if we're going to tie it more directly to that, then Beckert's book would be about free trade, free markets. And in your account of the book, Corey, when you enter the industrial age, he actually departs from the free markets and free trade story and starts emphasizing the state, the political coercion. So that's kind of funny and a little bit different to what one would expect from a Fukuyaman history of global capitalism, to put it that way. So that's a little bit different, and I'm not sure what to make of that, other than, again, perhaps the way that post-history is done today is not, oh, it's all du commerce and lovely interchange across the globe. But the way that post-history is conceived today is it's all violence, it's all colonialism, and it's all bad. Except mainly it was Europeans, because we want to be woke, and we don't want to say that Arab Muslims were doing colonialism either, something like that. And then I have a final point, I guess, about what history looks like within total capitalism, if there is a return of history. But maybe that's a big theoretical point, which could maybe or maybe not return to at the end of that. But I'll just leave those points there about the specific Fukuyaman end of history, which would be a free trade, free market story, and then how Beckert treats violence and coercion as kind of central to capitalist history, and specifically industrial capitalist history.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm trying to figure out which to take first. Let's start with the violence part, because then I think it explains the stuff about free trade and free markets. I didn't say this in the piece, but this conversation has brought this idea much more to the fore, which is that I think Beckert really thinks that one of the distinguishing features of capitalism is violence. And that's partially why the Muslim merchants aren't in a capitalist system, is because he doesn't attribute any violence to them. The trade just really happens in that is where you find du commerce. And it really is just a meeting of human needs across vast distances. And that's not capitalism. And capitalism begins when you get this extraordinary acts of violence, state violence, and that the violence is really from the state. And there's very little sense of market coercion, which we can talk about, particularly when it comes to the question of labor. But it is, what the state is it's Weberian power, of a very limited imaginative range. And I think that is really the big part of that story. And it gets him into trouble because it's hard to have a theory of history, or an account of history, I should say, or of historical change. And he wants to have accounts of historical change. So he has this big story of what he calls war capitalism, which is something that is like, let's say, 1500 to 1750 or 1780, something like that. And then industrial capitalism, as you say. But there are some differences, which we could talk about, involving the organization of economic life internally within firms and such. But the overwhelming feature of this is how similar these two stories look. And he claims that it's a break, but all the elements that he claims break are either very limited to the economic sphere or are in fact not breaks at all, that it is a really continuous story of violence. And that's why in the review, I say, suddenly you find yourself in a world, and it's the early 19th century, but it's clearly a world that is going to be, the colonial war, first war, the struggle for empire that leads to the First World War, and then ultimately the most hideous features of the Second World War, namely the use of slave labor in concentration and extermination camps. And I will say, to give him his due on this, there is one moment where he's talking about sugar production in Cuba. And this is, again, where he is quite good as historian. And if he just stuck to this kind of stuff, it would be a much better book. But he gives you this sense of sugar production. Cuba, I was stunned to find this out, had a railway system built before Spain did. And it had to facilitate from the sugar plants and the sugar plantations and the sugar manufacturing, the very quick distribution of the final product to the port, which would then put them on ships and go and off. And you have this sense of enslaved people coming in, which they're still coming into the 1860s, 1870s, being brought in, sent to these sugar plantations, turn out the product, which gets shipped out, and the level of enslavement and exploitation and death. It's hard not to think, because of the railway, of Auschwitz. I mean, he doesn't say this, but any sensitive reader would see that. And so there is a kind of evocativeness there that I think is very powerful. But again, back to the problems with this is that it is a very flat view of history, and ultimately a kind of moral one. And then you bring up the question of free trade and free markets. And it's just fascinating, because he says the world of industrial capitalism, by which he means at this point, late 19th century, early 20th century, the consolidation of firms, monopolies, and all the rest of it, was a break with, he says, the night watchman state, the laissez-faire state. And I thought, wait a minute, where was that laissez-faire state? Where was this state of free trade and free markets? I never saw that state. And I went back and reread like several hundred pages, and it literally appears. It's like a 2-page discussion centered around France in 1848, 1849, and 1850. And that's it. That's the only time and it's really a political platform more than it is a description of anything at all. So that free trade, free market world it just never appears at all in this book. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite confusing. And maybe I'm getting the confusion from your own confusion about reading the book, and then about Beckert's confusion, not yours, in interpreting it. But I find it difficult to really grasp this notion that what we in a Marxist account would understand as the core of capitalism, where commodity production becomes independent, albeit supported by the state, as the real thing, where that somehow almost never appears in here. And I don't want to just talk about Beckert, but I want to say, if we can, does that reveal something about our times, about an age of total capitalism, and how we can see or not see beyond capitalism? It's strange that commodity, that kind of the autonomy of commodity production is not the central story almost ever in this. I maybe I'm repeating my point from the other perspective about, for Beckert, it's violence, it's coercion, it's the state which is central. But I'm taken aback by it, and I don't know really what to do with it.
you should be taken aback by it, and I'm glad you don't know what to do with it, because I spent many months trying to figure out what to do with it. Just to reinforce the point, just to give you an example of in fact how this is the case, he makes a big deal of the Haitian Revolution and the emancipation of enslaved labor. And, it's the corollary to Hobsbawm's dual revolution, which, for Hobsbawm is the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution. For Beckert, it's the French Revolution. I'm sorry, the Haitian Revolution, excuse me. Different, French speakers, but different places.
Right.
And so you think, okay. But then when you start looking at what's the implication, it's not the rise of free labor. That's not the real story he's telling. It's not the spread of emancipation movements. It's not the rise of the largest mass movement for emancipation the world has ever seen in the United States. That's not really the story. What it is then sugar producers, cotton producers, and sugar and cotton mostly, going to find other sources of enslaved labor. And they go out to Asia, they go to Brazil, they go out, and that's the real impact of the Haitian Revolution. And that's not just a one-off, because then, he gets to the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and he's told you that free labor, wage labor, is the most, revolutionary part of capitalism. And if you're a Marxist, you're thinking, okay, I'm beginning to see this. But by the end of it, he tells you the distinction between wage labor and coerced labor is so will o' the wisp that you can't really make a distinction at all. So, we think of one of the big commodities of capitalism is supposed to be the market of labor, selling your labor power. And that just does not play a critical role. And that's true even of other commodities as well. It's not, as you say, commodity production, supported by the state. It's this very close linkage that never really changes all that much across time. And if that's the story you want to tell, fine, then tell that story. Somebody could make that argument, but he claims not to be doing that. And that's why it's very hard to understand it, because his theory, his analytical claims, such as they are, can't help you to understand the history he's telling, because the two things are completely at odds.
Right.
But I do think if we want to step back from Beckert, and how does this reflect the moment that we're in? I do think if the horizon of the world is, and I think Alex G, you could probably speak to this better than I, but I do think if the horizon of the world is capitalism, if everything is capitalism, then the question becomes, okay, let's have nicer versus worse forms of capitalism, and not even in the sense of a democratic socialist society with some forms of private markets or some market socialism. It's really, let's have some kind of capitalism where there's no violence. It's getting rid of the violence that's the real thing to be gotten rid of. And it kind of reminds me of those moments in Frederick Douglass's narrative where it's this real celebration of the wage as, the horizon of emancipation and freedom, because it's, in part the end of that kind of extraordinarily cruelly humiliating violence that he and other enslaved people had been subjected to. And we're now back to that as the horizon of emancipation. And that may not just be, I want to be open about this. That may not just be a failure of will and imagination on the part of the left. There are, forms of coercive labor that are coming back and becoming much more prominent. And you could see why people would, start thinking in these terms. But anyway, that's the way I sort of see that.
So, Corey, this kind of anticipated my last question, which is, I wonder if you can write a history of capitalism that doesn't include the history of class struggle against capitalism. So mostly what we've been talking about so far has been, the main defect is sort of without a real theory of capitalism, it just collapses back into sort of just the endless night that is human history. And it's all been kind of impulse to accumulate profits and to use violence when you can do that. And the critique of capitalism is the critique of violence. And then the counter story, which comes from many Marxists, is no, capitalism is a special historically emergent social structure. It's a structure of market dependent production where the wrong is not violence, but this impersonal form of domination. But one of the limits of that is that it isn't clear that it gets you history yet, because it doesn't get you conflict, struggle, contingency, when there were alternatives, what those alternatives are. And for that, you kind of need the class struggles against it as internal to the history so that it reads like a history, something that actually developed, had turning points, and where, ironically, there's a whole bunch of violence, but it's the violence specific to capitalism, the violence that workers use in their attempts to engage in strikes and various revolutionary activities, and the violence of the capitalist state suppressing those insurgencies. And it seems to me that it sounded like there wasn't very much of that in Beckert, but that this is also a feature of all the history of capitalism. I mean, it seems like what's happened is class struggle has been extruded from the history of capitalism and is now just called labor history. But history of capitalism is somehow now this weird contested terrain about the history of like commodities or markets or trading activities and their relationship to certain kinds of violence and their global or local character. But for there to be some sense of like the movement of something and a movement that's open, I've sort of come to kind of wonder whether you don't just need a better theory of capitalism, something more theoretically sophisticated and precise so that we could locate it in space and time. You also need this other, the human element, the political element, the way in which it generates a politics specific to capitalism, which is the politics of classes struggling against the historically specific forms of exploitation and violence to capitalism. I wonder if that is a sort of answers the question in the review about the fact that we still seem unable to write the history as history.
I wish we had had this conversation before I wrote the review, because I think that would have really been an excellent point to have made. As you were speaking, I was thinking, these Marxist theories, stagist theories of history are so out of fashion. But at their best, what is at the heart of it is class struggle, which precedes capitalism. And in, the Brenner account is part of the story of the creation of how capitalism is created, is class struggle between peasants and lords and the specific contingencies of all of that. And it's not just that it brings back the human element, but it actually brings back an explanation of the very thing you're supposed to be explaining. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think you've put your finger on it, that, in a lot of these stories, a lot of this new history of capitalism, and I don't think we've really understood this, that the removal of class struggle from that, that really, in the end, is really probably the biggest symptom and also the biggest source of this kind of depoliticized account of capitalism. It's political in the sense that it talks about violence and all of these kinds of bad things, but it's not a particularly what we would think of as a genuinely political account. And I think it's the absence of class struggle that attests to that. And I will say, in fact, I didn't talk about this in the review, but the moment where Beckert does actually do what you're talking about, which is not just narrating the story of working class struggles in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and not just doing it in Europe, by the way. I mean, that is very powerful, that Senegalese, railroad strike, and what's going on in Brazil and in parts of Argentina. I mean, it is really global. But why that section is so peculiar is because it's not just Beckert, doing the right thing by saying, oh, workers protested, blah, blah, blah. He actually shows how that actually drives the reorganization of capitalism in the 20th century. Capitalism as both an economic and a political activity. And if I had had this framework that you just the framework. This point about class struggle clear in my head. I mean, at all in my head when I wrote this. I could have actually, ironically, brought out this what is a strong moment in the book, but then nevertheless reveals the weaknesses of the rest. Because it's a very long book. But that is the moment where I think he shows that, and it's telling that he thinks it's one moment that then somehow disappears. Because of course, as you're saying, it happens all throughout. It happens in different ways, and it can be harder and easier to find in certain instances. But that really, that was the power of Genovese's account of slavery, whatever its problems were, was this very strong notion of class struggle shaping the slave system. And not just slave resistance in this, really narrow, unimaginative way that people talk about it, but really the political, economic, and historical fertility of enslaved people's actions, both in protest and not in protest. And I think that's really what is lost in this account, and not just in Beckert, as you say, but I think in the sort of broader new history of capitalism.
That's excellent. I mean, I don't know if Alex wants to come in on something. I mean, I found that all very thought-provoking. I don't know if we want to leave this here. I can't resist a kind of final comment, but that does really seem to be evocative of the age in which the only oppositional political activity that can be imagined is resistance to violence. And I'm put in mind even of the way that, I mean, you mentioned, Frederick Douglass's Celebration of the Wage as a kind of historical example of that, but perhaps today the embrace of precarity under the guise of autonomy, Uberization, etc., celebrated. I mean, I find this very much in Brazil. I don't know if it's so much the case in the US, but I certainly find it here where there's a great embrace still of Uberization as providing autonomy versus the kind of more formal relationships of the wage and contract and so on. And perhaps that's the only vision of kind of autonomy that's available. It's a very individualized form, of course. And I had so many more other points, but Alex, jump in, please.
No, I was just thinking, it did make me think that the irony is, I think at some point, Corey had said that at least Marx saw it not just as a monster, capitalism not just as a monster, but as a kind of marvelous monster. Could see the two-sidedness of what it was and what it is to become capitalist. And when your critique of capitalism just collapses into the critique of it as just sort of violent expropriation everywhere, and always on the verge of just collapsing into slave labor everywhere, you don't kind of really see how one of the most important features of a capitalist society is the way it also is this emancipating force. It brings into the being, holds up the possibility of people relating on a free and equal basis, and that is constantly undermining it. And that it really has motion when you have large masses of people trying to realize this kind of promise of freedom, but where the unfreedom isn't that you're going to get killed or whipped or beaten for failing to obey the orders of a particular master, but where you, despite a certain kinds of freedom you do enjoy on a labor market, making contracts, owning property, participating in commodity investment and all credit markets and consumer markets, nonetheless isn't really a way of fully realizing some kind of human freedom that everybody still wants. And being free of violence is not, it's obviously a necessary thing, and there's kind of absolute horrors associated with direct and extreme violence. But it seems to me you've just sort of lost all the critical force. You say Beckert says he's a critic of capitalism, but it doesn't sound like he's really told us what the politics of the critique of capitalism would be. And this is sort of the deeper kind of unpleasant, I don't know if the word is. It's strange that we still have this kind of dispute. That Dylan Riley had a piece in Sidecar a few days ago in which he was sort of just laying out some basic distinctions between capitalist and capitalism. And I just thought, how is it that this is still? These seems like such basic and elementary thoughts to have. There's something surprising to me about it, and I can't quite put my finger on what it is, except that it does make me wonder if, Alex and George and Phil were a bit too premature in declaring the end of history, because these seems like thoughts you have to get past and make some progress on before you can say history sort of, we're living in a moment where things are moving in a direction rather than just sort of continuing to disintegrate at a low rate.
Yeah,
maybe we'll leave that there. I mean, we're recording this on the 22nd of May. We're going to be debating some of these issues. This is stupid because I'm making a plug for something which for listeners will have been in the past. So I'm going to have to cut this out because it's
yeah, I don't think that's going to work. The end of history. History now falls back on itself in time.
Yeah.
And happens both before and after.
Yeah.
I mean, you did say, Corey, in the review something I thought was sort of, or you implied it, that there's a way in which history writing becomes more important as politics, as political stakes increase generally, not just when there's sort of a conflict between two grand visions, but and I do wonder if there is going to be increased stakes to being a historian, writing certain kinds of histories, especially as the authority of economists decline. So, historians retreated into writing local histories of maybe commercial success, but of not particularly broad intellectual significance at the very moment when the economists took over, the Clinton era, the 90s, the soaring heights of capitalism. And now, I do think one thing that Trump has meant, not just populism, but like the relative success of tariffs and things like that, is that it has really undermined the authority of economists. And it should be a moment when historians and history writing should play or start to play, or it's an opportunity for historians to be stepping into a void and exercising some authority they have failed to have. And at the very moment when the profession seems to be under a lot of attack within institutions and they can't, get jobs for any PhDs, I do wonder if there's sort of something in the background here of this kind of book and books like it, where it's sort of swinging and missing, maybe, but in a moment where there's maybe considerably more stakes to this kind of history writing, because there's it's been a long time since someone like Schlesinger could write, these sort of culture-defining histories of the New Deal and American history, and also play these direct roles in politics, political life, and advising in administrations. But I do kind of wonder if this is the other feature of a book like this in the moment that it's writing in, is that it's somehow actually underplayed what it could be doing.
Absolutely. I mean, the irony actually, though, is that there are a lot of historians who I think see themselves as intervening in the public square and, playing a not quite Schlesinger role, but that kind of, Substack version of that.
Right.
But you're right that the opportunity is for something much more robust. And yeah, I mean, if I were a younger scholar in history, I would use this book as a real opportunity. I would see it as an opportunity. I mean, I think the book is supposed to become the touchstone. And I've seen a lot of historians online rally around it. I don't get the sense it's because they've actually read it, but because it's, it aspires to monumentality and, this is the monument. But I do think there's an opportunity there for somebody to write a different kind of book that would actually speak to a lot of these questions and not sacrifice the scope and the ambition and the detail and the scale. I think, people love to pit theory against, empirical stuff and popular versus academic. And I think it's nonsense. I mean, Hobsbawm did it for his age. There's no reason why somebody shouldn't be able to do it for ours.
Great stuff. I'm going to continue this, but we'll, I guess, end this here.
Yeah.
Corey, thank you very much.
Oh,